as well known. And she's not the earliest of the aviators. So let's start. Here we go. Long Island is the cradle of aviation. And you can see on this map the early airfields on the Hempstead Plains, which are in the middle of Nassau County. They're ideally suited for flying. The Garden City, Mineola area had a number of airfields, and as you can see, their names changed over the years. And there were more airfields to the west that don't show on this map. But women have been involved in aviation on Long Island from the earliest years. It was September 1910 that the first woman aviator flew a plane here. And to put that in perspective, the Wright brothers made their first flights at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina in 1903, but the Wrights and Glenn Curtis upstate did not fly significant different distances until 1908, just 2 years before the first Long Island woman flew in 1910. The term used at the time for the women aviators was aviatrix or aviatresses. I don't particularly like those terms, so I'm just going to use aviators. And I would mention that, of course, most of the early aviators were men. My topic tonight, though, is early women aviators who have received less attention. And I think it's interesting that there are quite a few children's books on women aviators. Many more children's books than adult books, in fact. None, though, on Long Island women aviators. I'm going to be sticking to my notes because otherwise I would still be talking here at 9 or 10 o'clock. So to try to complete and leave time for questions. Whoops, now that's going to be a problem. Let's go back. First woman to fly on Long Island, Bessie Coleman. When she was studying music in Paris, she had been inspired by a French flyer, Ramon de la Roche, who was the first woman in the world to receive a pilot's license. Bessie Coleman and her husband, Francois, built a biplane in their living room in Mineola, and they assembled it on their front lawn. Rather than canvas and wood, which were usual at that time for planes, they used silk, bamboo, and piano wire for lightness. And Rach successfully flew that plane, and she was honored by the Aeronautical Society a few weeks later at a dinner. They proclaimed her, and I quote, the first woman aviator of America. And they awarded her a diamond-studded gold medal, which you see here. The Raches built 2 more planes, but Bessie soon gave up flying. She moved to California. She became a physician. Blanche Scott is sometimes mentioned as the first woman pilot, but her flight is not well documented. She was taking lessons upstate from Glenn Curtis, who had put a device on the engine so that it would not fly. And 10 days before Bessie Coleman's flight, the limiter device on her plane came off. And it's unclear whether that was an accident or whether it was the wind or whether Scott deliberately removed it. At any rate, she flew the plane a short distance. And that was in Hammondsport, New York, upstate, which incidentally has a nice museum up there, aviation museum. But I stick with Bessie Coleman, who certainly had the first intentional flight by a woman in the United States. Scott later flew on Long Island. In 1911, she set a distance record for women pilots of 60 miles flying from Mineola. You can see how flimsy those planes were in those days. Scott went on to become a professional pilot. She did stunt flying and was known as the tomboy of the air. She gave up flying in 1916. She was upset with the public, their fascination with crashes at air meets, and there were a lot of them in those days. She became a scriptwriter for movies and radio. Harriet Quimby fell in love with flying. Here's Harriet. When she attended the International Aviation Tournament on Long Island's Belmont Park in October 1910. That air meet attracted a crowd estimated at 10,000 spectators during every one of its 9 days. Quimby was born in Michigan. She grew up in Michigan and in California, and she wanted to become an actress, but she settled on a career in journalism. She did write a number of scripts for D.W. Griffith's short films, silent films. Quimby moved to New York City. In 1903, she became the drama critic for Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, and also wrote articles on other subjects, including automobiles. She owned and drove a car at a time when it was unusual for women to drive. Quimby met John Moisant at Belmont Park. She asked if he would teach her to fly. The Moisant Aviation School and most of the early aviation flights were where today's Roosevelt Field Mall is located. And I'll go back to that map. You see Roosevelt Field here, and the Moisant School was in this area as well. There were several names, as you can see, for that field. Hempstead Plains Field, Hazelhurst, Curtis, Roosevelt Field, named for Quentin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's youngest son, who was shot down in World War I over France. In the 1910s, references usually were to the fields are being on the Hempstead Plains or Mineola. The airfields were south of Old Country Road, which you see here, and extended to Merrick Avenue, where Fortunoff's and the Raceway were, Merchants Concourse shopping area. In the spring of 1911, Quimby took aviation flying lessons at the Moisant Aviation School. And Moisant's was one of the few aviation schools or flying schools that accepted women at that time. In fact, 4 of the first 10 women licensed pilots learned to fly at this school. Early morning, when there was less winds, was the best flying time, and especially for beginners. Quimby lived in Manhattan. She would get up early. She drove to Long Island to start her lessons at 4:30 in the morning. Quimby wrote about her experiences in her articles in Leslie's, gave details about her experience. So one was entitled, for example, How a Woman Learns to Fly, How I Won My Aviator's License. And to be licensed, one had to pass tests, just like one has to pass driving tests today for an automobile. Takeoffs and landings were the most difficult part. And on August 1st, 1911, Quimby became the first woman to be licensed to fly in America and the second in the world. Rach and Scott had flown in 1910, as I mentioned, but had not been licensed. And clothing was an issue for women. Skirts were obviously impractical and trousers not yet acceptable for women. Helene Dutroux had caused a sensation when she said that she did not wear a corset when she was flying because it restricted her too much. Some women flyers had skirts that they could button into bifurcated or divided legs. Quimby designed a unique flying suit, which was distinctive purple or plum colored, and you see the in color here on the stamp that was issued for her a few years ago. The Cradle of Aviation on Mitchell Field has a full-size diorama of Harriet Quimby, and you can see a replica of the costume that she designed. And she stands in front of a Blériot plane, which was the type that she flew or type she learned to fly in. And this was built in Hempstead. And that plane is also on the stamp. The Blériot plane at the Cradle of Aviation is the 4th oldest plane in the United States, perhaps the 10th oldest in the world, and it's probably the most valuable plane in the Cradle's collection, or so I'm told. Quimby had an interesting but rather brief career in aviation. She flew in fairs in New Jersey and Staten Island and won an uncontested cross-country race at the Nassau Boulevard Air Meet in Garden City, circling the field for 30 minutes, winning the $600 prize. And that would be the equivalent of more than $15,000 today. Quimby flew in Mexico in the Moissant's exhibition team with Matilda Moissant, who was a sister of John Moissant, who ran the aviation school. And in April 1912, Quimby was the first woman to fly across the English Channel. When flying in a meet in Boston, her passenger fell out of the airplane and she followed, falling to her death in July 1st, 1912. There is still debate as to the cause of that accident, but there were no enclosures on the planes at that time and no seat belts. So Quimby's aviation career lasted only a year, in fact. Let me add a footnote to this. So 25 years ago, I had a phone call from California asking if Hofstra's Long Island Studies Institute would host the 2nd annual Harriet Quimby conference. And I was literally speechless at that point. So there was a long pause. I couldn't imagine a whole conference on Harriet Quimby since her career in aviation had been so short, let alone a second one. But Gina Klutz was determined, and Hofstra and the Cradle of Aviation hosted that event in October 1996, and eventually a total of 5 conferences were investigating such minutiae as the pendant that Quimby wore on her final flight. And Kuntz published a journal with the conference papers, and finally a Harriet Quimby scrapbook, and for many years had a website devoted to Harriet Quimby. Kuntz donated her Quimby material to the International Air and Space Museum. More on Matilda Moissant, sister, as I said, it was Alfred Moissant who ran the aviation school. She took lessons the same time as Harriet Quimby. They became good friends, and Matilda was licensed 2 weeks after Harriet. So she was the 2nd woman in the United States to be licensed. And one Sunday at a dinner at the Moissants, a French guest doubted that she or any woman could really fly a certain plane that had a heavy engine. Matilda wanted to prove that she could, even though Nassau County Police had orders to arrest anyone who flew on Sunday. None of the male aviators had challenged this policy, but Matilda Moisant did. Police were at the airfield to enforce the policy against flying on Sunday. Matilda went up. She waved at the 4 motorcycle policemen who were ready to arrest her when she landed, and she went and landed at a different field nearby. The police raced there, were ready to arrest her, but the Moisants asked them to show their warrant, their arrest warrant, and they didn't have one. And besides, there was a crowd of some 300 people who had gathered, and virtually an ensuing riot that lasted almost a half an hour. The next day, Matilda went to the judge, who asked her if she was flying for money, and she wasn't. Some of you may remember that there were so-called blue laws that prohibited sales and certain activities on Sunday, and some were in effect into the 1950s and later prohibited stores, for example, certain stores, for example, from opening on Sundays. And the judge said, and I quote, "She's got just as much right to fly her airplane as you have to ride a motorcycle or anybody to drive an automobile," end quote. He dismissed her without a fine. Moisant said at one point, and I'm quoting, "I cannot watch a machine in the air without being overcome with a desire to fly myself. It is an intoxication, and I am afraid I can never be cured," end quote. Nonetheless, she gave up flying after a crash in 1912 when she was severely injured. Planes were very fragile in those days, whether biplanes with 2 wings or monoplanes with 1. In those decades, as I've mentioned, the cockpits were open, no seat belts, no brakes for landing. Accidents frequent. Number of women and even more men lost their lives in airplane accidents. Women were a great attraction at air meets. Plane manufacturers sponsored them to show how easy flying was, on the theory that if even a woman could do it, surely the men could. Women had their share of crashes, accidents, and deaths, and that was particularly so in that first decade of the 1910s. Exhibition flying, aerobatics, and barnstorming were common in those early decades. And if you've ever been to the Rhinebeck Aerodrome upstate, you have some idea of the type of activities. Now, most of their planes are from World War I and the 1920s, by which time aviation had become less dangerous. A word about my favorite suffragist, Rosalie Gardner-Jones. She became famous first by leading a hike from New York City to Albany in December 1912, and then from New York City to Washington in February 1913. At a suffrage parade she organized in May 1913, she arranged for a male aviator to lead the procession from Mineola to Hempstead in his monoplane. And a week later, at a flying carnival, as it was called, in Staten Island, she flew as a passenger in a Wright biplane and dropped suffrage leaflets. I don't expect you to be able to read anything much more than the headlines here, but that was the coverage of that carnival in Staten Island in the New York Times. And one of the things they wrote was, this was, quote, "the first time a suffragist had literally gone up in the air for the cause or opened a flying meet," end quote. Airplane flying was still dangerous. September 1913, Jones arranged an all-night suffrage aviation and encampment meeting at the Hempstead Plains Aviation Field in Garden City. Many flights were canceled because of the rain, but 50 women slept in one of the hangars, and Ruth Law did some exhibition flying and took passengers up for rides. And Law was the 6th woman to be licensed to fly, and later would set a number of records. And you can see how flimsy, again, these planes were at that time. I can't imagine going up in one myself. Just get some water. Bessie Coleman was born in Texas, living in Chicago when she wanted to learn to fly. Because she was Black, she had to go to France in 1920 to learn to fly. No school here would accept her. She earned an international aviation license and became the first African American and Native American to be licensed to fly. She had mixed heritage. Coleman did exhibition flying after she returned to the United States, and she flew in an air show in 1922 at Curtis Field, Long Island, honoring veterans of the all-Black 369th Infantry Regiment of World War I, popularly known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Coleman died in 1926 in a plane accident, so her aviation career, like Harriet Quimby's, was brief. This is that was a young adult book on Coleman, biography that was on that last slide. Here is my favorite suffragist, Eleanor Smith, and my favorite partly because she had solid Long Island connections, long career in aviation. She was born in New York City, but grew up and lived in Freeport during most of her active years in aviation. Her father, Tom Smith, was a vaudevillian. He played the Scarecrow in a touring company's Wizard of Oz. Eleanor's father fell in love with flying. While touring in California in 1916, Eleanor had her first plane ride at the age of 6. The family had been out for a Sunday drive. They came upon a French flyer who was giving airplane rides from an abandoned potato field for $5 or $10. What that would be between $100 and $200 today for a ride. Years later, in her memoir, she wrote about how beautiful the view was, and I quote, "It was totally unobstructed, and its beauty was breathtaking. Shafts of sunlight streamed down through broken clouds, turning the drab truck farms below into a fairyland of gilded greens and golds. Constantly changing cloud patterns were seemingly painted on a vast blue canvas by an unseen artist who directed the wind to airbrush his designs. I wanted never to leave." That was the first of many airplane rides for Eleanor. One of those times, the pilot let her take the wheel and steer for a time. When they landed, he said to her father, "She will fly one day with the great ones. She has the touch." When Tom repeated this to his wife murmured, "That's nice, but how can I get those awful grease spots out of her new pink dress?" Eleanor's father used airplanes on his tours. He hired a pilot, and he started taking flying lessons. And soon Eleanor was getting lessons too. She had to have blocks to reach the rudder pedals. As an adult, she was only 5'3" tall, so she was probably shorter at that time. She had a much better touch than her father for flying. He always had trouble with takeoff and landings, but Tom bought a Waco plane in 1927. Actually, he bought a few because he cracked up a couple of them. By this time, planes were more reliable. Flying was not as dangerous, but crashes were common, or not uncommon, I guess is better to say. Eleanor had many hours of flying instruction. She was begging her parents to let her solo. She was only 15 years old. Her parents had told her instructor not to teach her how to take off or land, to ensure that she would not go up alone. Her mother finally consented, and she started take off and landing lessons. And her father at that time was away on one of his tours. And what Eleanor would do would be to get up at daybreak, and I should have moved this ahead. There she is again. She would drive their car to a field in Wantagh. She'd been driving for years, though she didn't have a driver's license. She just went on the back roads. And then her instructor would fly her to Roosevelt Field for lessons, and she had to be back home by 7:45 to go to school. One day, her instructor jumped out of the cockpit and told her, "Go." He hadn't told her that morning that she was going to solo, and she was stunned for a minute, but she made 3 landings. Then she later recalled, "It was time to go back to Wantagh because I had to go to school." It was only 10 days or so after she started landing lessons and a total of 3.5 hours in the air that she soloed. As I said, she was 15 years old. She got a license at 16, the youngest person to be licensed to fly. And soon she was paying passengers for rides. Eleanor Smith is best remembered for flying under the 4 East River bridges in 1927 at the age of 17. And this is how it happened. There was a barnstormer from the Midwest who had tried without success to fly under the Hellgate Bridge. It's something Bert Acosta had already done, had his license suspended for doing it. At Roosevelt Field, one of the photographers got tired of the Midwesterner blaming his plane for the failure and tried to shut him up, saying, "It's been done before by an expert. When are you going to knock it off? Why, even little Ellie here could do it. Couldn't you, sis?" Eleanor Smith shrugged and said, "Yeah, sure, anytime." Well, within a few days, there was a betting pool at the airfield, and Eleanor decided to fly not just under one bridge, but under 4 bridges. She planned carefully, deciding to go on a Sunday when there was less traffic on the river. She took off on a Waco 10 plane from Roosevelt Field, flew first under the Queensboro Bridge, then the Williamsburg, Manhattan, and Brooklyn Bridge. That required real skill. It is a feat no one has duplicated to this day. Now, Eleanor feared her license would be suspended. She'd been photographed. She was summoned to City Hall. Mayor Jimmy Walker grounded her for 10 days, but it was retroactive, so she only lost a few days of flying. And the mayor put in a good word for her with the Department of Commerce in Washington. She received a letter of reprimand from the department with a note asking for her autograph. I mentioned before the issue of clothing. Eleanor hadn't paid much attention to the clothes she wore flying, but in 1930, an article in the New York Sun reported, and I quote, "Roosevelt Field's hard-boiled aviators were goggle-eyed yesterday at the appearance of a flyer in warm weather shorts. Eleanor wore a white short-sleeve shirt, open at the neck, white slippers, and socks. The shorts were of white duck and came within an inch of her knees." End of quote from the Times. A woman wearing shorts in public in 1930 was newsworthy. Eleanor Smith delivered and demonstrated Waco planes for which she was paid. She also did cross-country flying, set a number of speed, altitude, and endurance records. One of her records of 26 hours and 23 minutes in the air may still stand. She also did a record endurance flight with another woman flyer of 42.5 hours. They refueled in the air. Smith received money for endorsements and flying exhibitions. At one exhibition, she had 7 parachutists jumped from her plane. And that needed some skillful flying to ensure that she did not interfere with their parachutes. The press called her the Flying Flapper, and she did not appreciate that title. She thought flapper implied someone who partied a lot, which she did not do. Now, Smith spent some time in Hollywood flying in films, doubling in aerial shots for the starring actress. She was hired by NBC to be a radio commentator on aviation competitions, and she became a celebrity. And she received her transport license when she was old enough. She later described the transport license as, quote, the pilot's doctoral degree. It was the ultimate proof of your competence to fly any aircraft, anytime, anywhere. And she did fly all types of planes. She continued to fly, set 4 major world's records in 1 year. And there's Orville Wright's signature that I mentioned on the on her transport license. The American Society for the Promotion of Aviation had licensed pilots vote on the best pilots, and Eleanor Smith was voted the best woman pilot, and Jimmy Doolittle the best male pilot in 1930, the first year of the award. Smith continued active flying in the 1930s and set more records. After she married, she took time out to raise 4 children, but continued her interest in aviation. She addressed the Air Force Association on Mitchell Field, flew a jet trainer, and was a charter member of the Long Island Early Flyers Organization. And here she is at the cradle of aviation. I had the pleasure of hearing her speak some years ago. You can read her story in her autobiography, Aviatrix. She was 98 years old when she died in 2010. So, famous Long Island woman aviator. Following Charles Lindbergh's solo nonstop flight across the Atlantic in 1927 from Roosevelt Field, there were a number of women that wanted to do it as well. Ruth Elder was the first to attempt it. She flew from Roosevelt Field in October 1927 with her instructor, George Haldeman, as the pilot. They encountered bad weather and an oil leak, so they ditched in the ocean 300 miles short of land. And Ruth was at the controls for 9 hours on that flight. Frances Grayson, who lived in Forest Hills in Queens, also attempted the flight, left Long Island in December with a male pilot. And the navigator, that their plane was lost. But another one, Mabel Bowl, first woman to fly nonstop from Mitchell Field on Long Island to Havana, Cuba in March 1928. She was a passenger on that flight, and she was a Hollywood actress known as the Queen of Diamonds because she liked to wear all of her jewels in public. Bowl wanted to fly the Atlantic. June 1928, she was ready to fly across the Atlantic just a year after Lindbergh's flight. But enter Amy Phipps Guest of Westbury, daughter of John Phipps, who built old Westbury Gardens. She thought Mabel Bowl was not the right right sort of girl to be the first woman to fly the Atlantic. So Amy leased a Fokker plane from Richard Byrd, hired a pilot. Now, Amy Guest at that time was 55 years old. She was described as stout and matronly, but physically daring. She had been big game hunting in Africa. She rode the hounds fox hunting. Amy told one of her brothers about her plans, and though she had sworn him to secrecy, he in turn told her eldest son, who was at Columbia Law School. Amy's son confronted his mother, saying that he would not be able to study for his exams and she'd make him fail if she flew. So Amy Guest reluctantly bowed to family pressure, but she told her brother to find a well-educated flyer with manners and the right image to fly in the plane with the male pilot and navigator that she had hired because she didn't want Mabel Bowl to go. The pilot they picked was 30-year-old Amelia Earhart. Amy financed her flight, and Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly the Atlantic in June 1928, ahead of Mabel Bowl, the Diamond Queen, whose flight was aborted in Newfoundland because of the weather. Earhart became a celebrity when she landed in Wales. She received a ticker tape parade. When she returned to New York, she downplayed her accomplishment, saying, "I was just baggage." She wasn't flying it. But Earhart had never touched the controls on that flight, although the plane used instrument flying, which she had not hadn't trained for yet. So Amelia Earhart's initial fame was financed by a Long Islander, Amy Phipps Guest, and that flight propelled Earhart to fame. 4 years later, Earhart did fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932. And as I mentioned, in 1937, Earhart disappeared in the Pacific on an attempt to fly around the world. I recall Eleanor Smith saying that Amelia Earhart wasn't a very good pilot, although she would never put that, I don't think, that's not in her book. She wouldn't say that in writing. The first National Women's Air Derby was held in August 1929, and here's this picture is showing one a year later. It was open to women pilots licensed by both the International Aeronautical Federation and the National Aeronautical Association, who had a minimum of 100 hours of solo flying, and at least 25 hours in cross-country flying. There were only 70 women in the country that met those qualifications in 1929, 20 of whom entered the race. There were a number of crashes, several forced landings, and one fatality. Aviators had to use dead reckoning, road maps. They could not fly at night at that time. 8 days later, 15 of the 20 competitors completed the race that was going from California to Cleveland. And Louise Thaden was the winner. And newspapers called this the Powder Puff Derby. A number of alumni of that race, including Fay Gillis and Amelia Earhart, proposed organizing licensed women pilots and called a meeting in November 1929 at Curtis Field in Valley Stream, now the site of a shopping center. Their purpose was mutual support and the advancement of aviation, good fellowship jobs and files on women in aviation. There were 26 women who attended that meeting, and that included Eleanor Smith. I'm not sure where she is in this picture, can't find her easily, but the variety of names were proposed for the organization: climbing vines, bird women, gadflies, and skylarks. And they finally decided on whatever number of charter members they had by a deadline date. They had 99 charter members, and hence to this day, it is the 99s. Marjorie Gray, who ran her own flight school on Long Island, organized the Long Island chapter of the 99s in 1965. And that group erected this bronze plaque on the sculptured relief of that photograph you just saw, and telling about the organization being starting there. It dedicated this at the shopping center on the 50th anniversary in 1979. You can see this plaque now in the American Airpower Museum at Republic Airport in Farmingdale. The 99s is an international organization and today has more than 5,000 members, dedicated to preserving the unique history of women in aviation, providing networking and scholarship opportunity for women in aviation education, and promoting world fellowship through flight. In 1928, the Long Island Aviation Country Club was organized in Hicksville, in what today is part of Levittown. That is where Charles Lindbergh taught his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, to fly. She's best known today as the author of The Sea Around Us. That club operated until 1950 when Levitt purchased the property. And it was a country club for airplanes and popular if you were wealthy enough to have your own airplane. Adelphi College, which was then a women's college, had a civilian pilot training program in the late 1930s under the Civil Aeronautics Administration. Ruth Nichols started the program, and it was not limited to Adelphi students. There was at least one Hofstra student who enrolled in that program. As war clouds increased, the civilian pilot training program required a pledge of military service. And since women were not admitted to the military at that time, it excluded women. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt unsuccessfully protested that change. I focused on the early decades and a few of the leading women, but I want to say a few words about developments during World War II. With the approach of the war in Europe in the 1930s, Jackie Cochran recruited about 24 American women to aid Great Britain's air transport auxiliary. President Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor were interested, and eventually this led to women in military service, the WACs, the WAVES, and some other groups. Most pertinent here, the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service Pilots that Cochran headed. And what they did was take planes or ferry planes from manufacturers to the bases where they were needed. They towed targets, they freed up men for flying in combat. And a Long Islander, Betty Gillies, was the first pilot to qualify for the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which was a predecessor of the WASPs. Gillies had begun flying at Roosevelt Field in 1928. She was only 5 feet tall. She had to have extensions on pedals so she could reach them. Gillies was a founding member of the 99s and president in 1939 and 40 to 41. She was one of the first women to receive a transport pilot's woman license in 1930. She worked for Curtiss, selling and demonstrating airplanes through the 1930s, founded Gillies Aviation in the late 1930s, and sold Waco and Grumman Goose's the airplanes. Between 1941 and 42, she was a test pilot at Grumman, testing new Wildcat and Hellcat fighters. And then Gillies joined the organization that became the WASPs. She really became second in command to Nancy Love at the WASP base near Wilmington, Delaware. More than 1,000 women served in the WASP. They ferried, as I said, tested planes. They also instructed male pilots. And when they were towing targets, that was for anti-aircraft artillery practice. Technically, the WASPs were not in the military, though they were treated in many ways as military. 38 WASPs died in service, accidents, aviation accidents mostly. There was one that was from sabotage by a disgruntled man who put sugar in the tank, causing the plane to crash. When one of the WASPs died, the other women had to take up a collection to return their bodies home. The government did not provide funds for that. Marjorie Gray, whom I mentioned, was in the first class of WASP in Houston, Texas. And here is another Long Island WASP, Margaret Weber, dropped out of college to take flying lessons, obtained her pilot's license in 1941. She was in the last WASP class in Houston, which did not have an opportunity for active service because the WASP were disbanded in December 1944. She worked in aviation for a while and was a long-time resident of Garden City. WASP finally received military status retroactively in 1977. And in 2010, Peggy Gilman was among the surviving WASP who received the Congressional Gold Medal. There's an exhibit on the WASP at the Airpower Museum in Farmingdale. When I saw it, it was near the plaque to the 99s. In 1977, the Air Force and other military academies opened to women. We now have women astronauts, military women serving as pilots, aviation mechanics, and of course, many other specialties in aviation fields, including in combat areas. I mentioned Gillies being a test pilot, and there were 3 or 4 women pioneer test pilots. Another one was Teddy Kenyon. Her husband, Ted Kenyon, was an airplane pilot who had taught her to fly. She earned her pilot's license at Roosevelt Field, and Grumman hired Teddy Kenyon in 1942 to deliver airplane parts. And there are the 3 test pilots in World War II at Grumman. Bud Gillies, who's I've already mentioned, his wife was a WASP pilot, and it was he who asked Kenyon, Barbara Jane, and Elizabeth Hooker, who you see here, if they would like to test warplanes. Grumman was the first American company to employ women as test pilots. The women initially encountered some resistance from male pilots. They proved to be good flyers and soon won acceptance. My focus has been on pioneer women pilots. The number of women pilots increased over the years. And incidentally, the first woman captain of a commercial airliner was Helen Ritchie in the mid-1930s. Don't believe she was a Long Islander, but she faced so much difficulty from men that she left. The next woman commercial airplane captain was not until the 1970s. That took 4 decades. Women airline pilots are more common today, though it's still quite a small percentage. Many Long Island women participated in World War II on the home front. We're familiar with Rosie the Riveters. On Long Island, it's the Janes who made the planes. In the airplane factories during World War II. During the war, women were 30% of Grumman's workers and an estimated 60% at Republic. And most of the women were on the production lines and received good wages in those wartime jobs. These pictures were from the Grumman History Center, which has moved to the cradle of aviation. And while these women did not fly, they made our air superiority possible. And I would also just add parenthetically that During World War II, the federal government provided child care for women who were working outside the home. The president now is trying to catch up with that. Many Long Island women participated in World War, losing myself. I said earlier, women have been involved in aviation on Long Island almost from the beginning. At a time when a woman driving an automobile was unusual, flying a plane was even more so. Long Island's pioneer women pilots paved the way for other women and men by making aviation tamer and more acceptable. They prove flying is safe and that women make good pilots. The daring and intrepid Airwomen, as the press liked to call the pioneer pilots, are part of our aviation and Long Island heritage. All of these women made history, and museums such as the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City and the Airpower Museum in East Farmingdale help preserve that history. I believe the Cradle has reopened. If you've never been there or haven't been there recently, it's well worth a visit. I think the Airpower Museum is probably open as well. Here are some of my sources. This is a book on the women air service pilots, the WASPs. These would be available. And at Hofstra, we had a number of conferences, and here's one that this was one of our very first books with an article. Joanne Lynn was one of my students and has an article on Women's Cradle of Aviation. And we have an article in this book on Harriet Quimby and another article by Joanne Lynn, which Harvey now, on early women aviators, plus the women in the home front. And in my book, I have a chapter on women aviators, and you see down here on the cover, Harriet Quimby. I'm sorry I didn't have that in color. Let me go back. I should have had a picture of her in her plum colored aviation suit. But those books will be available in local libraries, some available for sale. And finally, if you want a list of your women aviators, a bibliography, just send me an email. I've put my email up there, and I hope we've got some time for some questions. If you haven't put them in the chat room, or do so, and we can. How are we doing, Stephanie?
Great.
Do you have any questions?
We don't have questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it. You don't have to put it in the chat.
Okay, so.
I'd like to mention that this is May 11th, which is the birthday of Harriet Quimby.
Good observation, Ira. Thank you. Harriet Quimby's birthday. Okay.
Excellent talk, Natalie.
Julia, is that Julia?
Yeah, something happened to my computer in the middle. It started updating itself.
Julia was
yeah.
the curator at the Cradle of Aviation, and she probably knows more than
American
I do about women aviators.
Bye-bye. Yeah, I'm the curator of the WASP exhibit at the American Airpower Museum, and I mentioned that the 99s exhibit, the plaque was at the Airpower Museum, but it was moved before the COVID virus to the Cradle because it's more appropriately placed there.
Thank you. I should
Welcome.
double checked on that, but I
No, that's okay.
You.
A lot happened in the last year since we moved it.
So the plaque to the 99s is now at the Cradle of Aviation Museum,
Yes.
and that is open. And Is the Airpower Museum open as well?
Oh, yes, we've been
Yes.
open for a few months and
Okay.
we are now in full operation, but
So
yeah,
if you're
the
looking
limiting
for
amount
things
of
to
people.
do, you can go see, the Cradle of Aviation Museum is really a wonderful museum with, from balloons and gliders to the spaceships. And the space exhibit was redone a couple years ago when we had the anniversary there. So, okay, anyone else? I'm afraid to stop sharing that I'll lose everybody. So I'll just not try to do that. Okay, so any questions or comments?
Yes, I have a comment, or rather a question. So were all these women wealthy? Was that what enabled them to be able to participate in these activities?
It helped. Most of them, many of them had money. Some of them did not. Bessie Coleman wasn't all that wealthy. She worked to earn money and took to be able to go to France to take lessons. But it did take, it took money. Yes, but they weren't wealthy, most of them. I mean, but many of them, to be able to afford it. You know, what did I say? That even to take for Eleanor to take a ride in that plane, $5 or $10, but a couple $100 in today's money. So, and lessons, I don't have prices for lessons, but they were going to be expensive. And if you went, but if you became a professional aviator and participated in those meets, there were big prizes, large prizes. You could earn a lot of money as long as you didn't crash and kill yourself. And some people did.
Hey,
Okay.
Natalie, I have a question for you. It's Linda DeMata. How are you?
Ah, Linda, I saw your name there.
It's
From
good to
Hofstra.
see you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that I think it was you, one of them you said used to fly, I think it was Eleanor, or I can't remember which one you said used to fly for some films for Hollywood.
Yeah, she was a second in number of films. You know,
So-
when they would use, if you had something dangerous to do, they didn't let the star do it, but somebody who knew what they were doing. So she would be flying some films.
So
And I
are
don't
you?
know the names of the films, but
Oh,
maybe.
I was actually asking if you've ever seen any of the films, or if you're aware of whether the films still exist. It would be kind of fun to see them.
Yeah, I don't know, and it's quite a while since I read her book, but I found my copy. She inscribed it, in fact. I'll have to take a look. I'll let you know if she says anything on which movies.
Sure. Thank you. It was a great presentation, and it was really great to see you again.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we did it in an hour, less than an hour. Okay. So unless anyone else has question or comment, and as I said, as you can see, if you want more, okay. Are we, what did I do? Thank you all for coming. Coming? Is that the right word? Viewing? Watching. I guess that's the word. And fair winds for all as we get through this pandemic. Thank you all again, and appreciate your participating, and have a good evening, rest of the evening now.
Thanks, everyone.